Okay, so this is the introduction to lesson 2, the physical environment. And as you all know, I was supposed to give this as an introduction during our sync session for Feb 22, Monday, but classes got cancelled. So I hope everyone's safe. I hope you're all doing well. Let's begin this lesson, or the intro to this lesson. So from last week's lesson, which I hope you already finished, you learned that all biomes and pretty much all habitats, terrestrial and aquatic, have their own distinct environmental parameters. Okay? They have their own sets of normal temperatures or precipitation levels that happen all throughout the year, with some changes, of course, based on seasons. For example, in the tropical rainforest, what you'd expect are high amounts of rainfall all throughout the year and roughly a uniform level of temperatures, which is usually high. So what leads to the presence of these environmental parameters? This is the main point of this lesson, which is about the physical environment. So in this lesson, we will be focusing on different factors that affect the parameters of each environment itself and the organisms that are found within them. So what will we be taking up? Well, we'll mostly focus on sunlight, temperature, water availability, and more. So let's first look at sunlight. So as we all know, sunlight is a major factor that affects nearly all environments on Earth. Everything in the surface of the Earth is affected by sunlight. And actually even the things under the surface, because as you've learned in the previous lesson, even the lower levels of seas and oceans are still somewhat affected either directly or indirectly by the presence of sunlight. So let's have a short review, and I'll give you, of course, some expectations then as to what to look forward to in this lesson. So again, what does sunlight affect? First is temperature. And you've already learned this in the previous lesson again. Okay? So the more sunlight there is, the more directly the sunlight hits in an area, then you would expect temperatures to be higher. It's either you're talking about air temperature, ground temperature, or water temperature. It doesn't really matter. As long as there's more sunlight, you'd expect higher temperatures to be present. So you also learned about how wind patterns are affected by sunlight. Okay? Diba? From the previous lesson, we mentioned that the air circulation cells around the world are driven by the temperatures coming from the sun. And so are seasonal changes. Okay? So the differential heating on different parts of the Earth based on Earth's tilt or rotation, revolution, the many factors we mentioned last lesson lead to seasonal changes. Sunlight also affects the amount of precipitation that areas get. So if you remember transpiration, evaporation, these processes all contribute to the formation of precipitation either by rain or by snow, sometimes sleet, sometimes hail. Biological processes are also affected. Remember that photosynthesis usually cannot happen without sunlight except in very, very special cases. Artificial light sometimes can be used. But, of course, most environments on Earth, or pretty much all environments on Earth, are dependent on sunlight in terms of photosynthesis. And many other natural processes are affected, which you will learn about more in this lesson. So aside from sunlight and temperature, the presence of water is also a major factor that affects entire environments and the organisms that are found within. I mean, it's pretty obvious why water is important. All organisms need water to survive, and we drink it in. Plants use it for their many metabolic processes. Animals do too. But aside from those, okay, water has many physical properties that make it an excellent resource for organisms and an excellent medium for organisms to survive in, especially aquatic organisms. The first is its stability as a medium. What does this mean? Water as a medium. Okay, before we get to water as a medium, let's first discuss the medium that we have as terrestrial organisms. Okay, so organisms on land, like us humans, have air as our medium because we're directly exposed to air. Okay, organisms that are in aquatic habitats have water as a medium. And like what we mentioned earlier, water is a very stable medium that makes it excellent for survival of aquatic organisms. So how? What are we talking about when we say that water is stable? Okay? Well, the main reason for water being stable that we will discuss in this lesson is via temperature. Okay? Water usually has a very stable temperature no matter what you do to it, no matter what natural environmental factors you expose it to. Again, you'll learn about it in this lesson. Okay? Next, shock absorbent properties. So water is a natural shock absorbent. So it's no wonder that complex life, grew out of the water. Well, not grew out of the water, but developed in aquatic environments. Okay? Why is this? Okay? One of the main reasons is through water's shock absorbent properties. Okay? Organisms that are submerged in water are less prone to damage from the environment. Okay? And this is also one of the reasons why when humans are pregnant, they have a baby inside, and the baby is surrounded by a liquid medium. Okay? This is precisely because of that, the shock absorbent properties of water. So organisms that are immersed, like aquatic organisms, thoroughly enjoy this property of water. And as we mentioned earlier, water is also important in other biological processes, specifically the metabolic processes that humans, plants, bacteria, pretty much all organisms undergo. And finally, water has a very large effect on the other parameters that can be found within environments. And again, we'll discuss this in more detail in this lesson. So far, we've mentioned sunlight, temperature, and water. And these three factors affect organisms in the environment. Of course, by the way, these aren't the only three things that affect them. Okay? But these three are notable enough for organisms to have, large adaptations for survival regarding meeting the parameters that these pose. Okay? So how do organisms cope then? So I'll be giving you specific examples of organisms and how they cope. First, we have Ursus maritimus, or the polar bear. Okay? Polar bears obviously have to adapt to, or have to have certain adaptations that will allow them to survive in polar areas. Okay? By the way, where are polar bears found? North Pole or South Pole? Most people think, or not most of them, but a lot of people think that it's both. No, it's only in the areas close to the North Pole. Okay? That's why Antarctica is called Antarctica. It's anti-Arctos. Arctos referring to bears. There are no bears in Antarctica. Okay, so that's one reason. Another reason is that the bear constellations aren't seen from Antarctica. See, just some useless facts, I guess. Anyway, so what are the adaptations that polar bears have? Well, in order for them to not freeze to death, they have 2 layers of fur. That's why they appear so fluffy. Look at this photo there. Okay, and one of these layers of fur, okay, is composed of hollow hair. So what's this hollow hair for? So as you can see in this picture here, this is a hair shaft. So you see that there's a space inside. So that's what makes it hollow. So what is it for? Well, this allows for a specialized scattering of light that makes the bear appear kind of luminous white. Why is it important for the bear to appear luminous white? Well, just look at the kind of background that it has. Okay, it's snow. So appearing to be that color in that kind of environment essentially makes the bear almost invisible. Well, not invisible, but hard to see. Okay? So this allows the bear to hunt more effectively. What about heat retention? Of course, the hair allows the bear to trap heat under the hair and close to the skin. Okay? Which allows the bear to heat up the air using its own body temperature and allows or prevents heat from escaping. Polar bears also have thick amounts of blubber. So these are fats that insulate heat, and blubber is very effective since it effectively prevents, heat loss even when the bear's swimming in polar waters. The diet of polar bears is also a very good example of how it keeps warm. Okay, bears have polar bears specifically have a very high fat diet, very rich in energy. They normally eat seals and baby seals, which are very blubbery. And finally, they have adaptations for swimming, specifically strong limbs and wide, paws for paddling. Next, let's discuss some of the adaptations that sharks have. So sharks have a rectal gland, as you can see here. Okay, it's encircled here. So the rectal gland is a specialized gland found, surprise, surprise, close to the rectum. It's for removing salt from their bodies. Why do they need to remove salt? Well, sharks are constantly immersed in seawater, which means that they're constantly drinking it in. So they take in seawater, including water and salt, and they have to have some way of removing the excess salt from their bodies, which is through the rectal gland. So they also have specialized kidneys for removing excess salt and for conserving water to prevent them from losing too much water. I'll explain why later in the discussion proper. And their liver is a very interesting adaptation. Okay, shark livers produce copious amounts of oil and in some species lots of urea. Okay, so why is this important? Well, oil is for buoyancy. It helps the shark become more buoyant. Urea, on the other hand, changes the composition or the concentration of compounds. Why did I say stuff? Of compounds in its tissues. And why is this important? Why is increasing the amount of compounds important? I'll explain in the discussion of this lesson. Okay? But it has something to do with osmoregulation. In that it increases the concentration of the shark itself, the tissues of the shark itself, as opposed to the salt in the surrounding waters. So this has to do with the exchange of water and other solutes between the shark and its environment. Okay. Next, they have heat-generating red muscles. So in a way, you can consider sharks to be warm-blooded. Some species of sharks, take note, because some are purely cold-blooded. Okay, but the species that are many species found in cold areas in particular have heat-generating red muscles for them to be able to produce their own heat. Okay, they also have white muscles, by the way. These white muscles are used for short bursts of speed, whereas the red muscles are the default ones that they use when they swim at normal speeds. Okay, so this means that when they swim at normal speeds, then they're constantly generating heat. They also have modified vessels for thermoregulation, okay, which allows them to lose less heat to the environment. And in some polar sharks, they have specialized antifreeze compounds, and the presence of these two, so urea and trimethylamine oxide, also known as TMAO, help prevent freezing. Next, let's discuss camels. So camels have thick fur on top and thin fur at the bottom. Why? Because the top side of the camel is the one that's more exposed to sunlight. So the thick fur helps prevent excessive sunlight from getting to the tissues of the camel. Why is there thin fur at the bottom? That's for camels to lose the heat that they accumulate through the thin fur. Of course, it's going to be hard to do that if they have thick fur at the bottom, right? Or everywhere else. They also have concentrated urine and feces, so this means that they don't lose as much water to their urine and feces. Why? Why is this important? Again, because they're found usually in very dry environments. Okay? So water is a very precious resource for them. Aside from concentrated urine and feces, they also perspire minimally. They don't produce a lot of sweat, which also helps them conserve water. Their nasal passages are also specialized to allow the recondensation of water. Remember that when you breathe, with every breath out, okay, with every exhale, you lose water, okay, to the air. What camels do is that, or what the nasal passages of camels do is that it allows water to recondense inside, essentially allowing the animal to reabsorb water back into its body. So perhaps the most notable adaptation that camels have, that most people know of, we have the humps. Okay? So what do the humps contain? Most people think that it contains water. No. Okay? Camel humps contain fat, which they deplete in times of food scarcities. So you see that this camel has 2 humps, this camel has 1. So this is a Bactrian camel, the one on the left, and this is an Arabian camel, the one on the right, also known as a dromedary. Let's write that down. So this one is a Bactrian camel. So Bactrian camels are named after Bactria, or the ancient region of Bactria. Okay, so these camels, the modern range of these camels, they're usually found in the Istan countries. So we have Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, those. These ones, on the other hand, if I'm not mistaken, are found in the Arabian Peninsula and the areas around it. And finally, camels also have adaptations to their blood. So how? When other organisms become dehydrated, for example, humans, okay, we lose water in our blood. So our blood becomes too thick to function properly. Okay, this doesn't happen to camels. Well, okay, it happens at some point. Okay, but essentially they're more resistant to dehydration than other organisms. Okay, the excessive thickening of blood doesn't happen until much later on if the camel is severely dehydrated. So it's not just animals that have specialized adaptations to meet water, temperature, and sunlight requirements. Plants also do it too. So an example, we have Nymphaea, or more commonly known as the water lilies, of which there are many species. So just some examples of adaptations that they have. So the leaves of water lilies, as you can see here, the floating leaves, are reliant on the surface tension of water, which allows them to float. and be exposed to sunlight. So since they're exposed to sunlight from the top of the leaf, the chloroplasts are only found on top, because it's going to be such a waste if you put all the chloroplasts at the bottom, right? And of course, there's a lateral spread of foliage. So this lateral spread of foliage allows the plants to absorb as much sunlight as they can without overlapping with each other, because if they overlap, then they'll just be blocking sunlight off of each other, which is very wasteful. We also have Welwitschia. So Welwitschia is a desert plant. So Welwitschias are native to Africa, specifically the very dry parts in the desert. So as a response, these organisms have developed a deep root system to allow them to absorb water from deep underground. Aside from that, they also use their stomata for absorbing water. So how do they do that? Well, what they do is they open their stomata and absorb water from the air. Of course, this can be very problematic, because if they keep their stomata open during the hot hours of the day, then they'll probably lose more water than they gain. So as a result, they have a differential opening and closing of stomata. Their stomata are usually open during cooler parts of the day or at night, and these are usually closed when the sun is up to prevent excessive water loss. Why is this slide here? This slide is not supposed to be here. Sorry. Alright, so that ends the intro. Sorry for that previous slide. Okay, so just some takeaways before you begin the lesson. I want you to keep in mind that organisms have adaptations to meet the environmental parameters in the areas where they exist. So I gave you 5 examples: sharks, camels, I forgot the others. Sorry. So anyway, I give you 5 examples just as an intro to this lesson. Okay? The lesson will be a bit more technical, so we'll get into more details about how the different parameters affect organisms and how organisms respond to these parameters. So if you have any questions, since we didn't have a sync session, just feel free to message me. Thank you, and please stay safe because there's a typhoon.